All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to our third and last session. This is a three-part webinar series, so we're going to close out today as we prepare in a couple weeks to close up our program years at churches. I know things are going to start getting quiet at my church, so we can start looking ahead to planning for next year, which it's looking like will be better than the last year. And I know our choir is looking forward to coming back, and we're having our congregation come back in person on the 23rd for the first time since October. And a lot of other churches have already come back, so things are moving in the right direction. We have somebody new today. Joseph, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a biology professor really most of the time, but I do play in a couple of churches, and and we have an interfaith center at our campus that has an old Allen now. So I'm still linked to Allen. The other churches have other things. Either it's the pipe organ or it's a competitor. I won't mention their name.
Fair enough. All right. So just kind of recap a little bit. I'm playing from the studio in Worcester, G-Paul Music, and this instrument that I have in front of me that you'll see in a minute, I have another camera angle, is a G330 with Genesis voices, which we talked about the last time. So in session one, that was 2 months ago, we covered basic registration and setting up the console for your particular worship service. Building on that in session two, we looked in more detail at supplementing the organ's built-in specification with additional sounds, specifically through Genesis voices that we have on this instrument, but it's also applicable to MIDI if you have an external MIDI device, or alterable stops for older Allen instruments, whatever system you're working with. So now that we have the organ voices where we want them, and we know where to find them, what else can we do to enhance the sound of the instrument and bring our music to the next level? We really want to elevate the experience of the worshiper in the pew. So what we're going to be looking at today is other features of the instrument beyond the built-in voices, that basic specification. Say when you turn on the organ, the voices that are there for you, and some other things that you can do to kind of enhance the service playing. Each of the features that we're going to look at today could have an entire session, could have multiple sessions devoted to it to cover everything. So this is a very general overview. Hopefully pick up a couple of useful things. If you have any questions at the end of this or that come up in the next couple of weeks, if you go back to review this when it's up on the website and you have something you're not sure about, just shoot us an email. We'll be happy to help you. The first thing that we're going to look at today are called suites. This organ and others from the same generation have 6 independent, complete, and historically informed sample sets that are curated by Allen Organ Company. The first one is called Classic Allen, and if you purchase an Allen instrument, that's the default specification that loads up when you turn the organ on. This one acknowledges the heritage of the company's sampling technology. They were the pioneers of this in 1971. So 50 years this year, they're celebrating of digital organ sampling. And it has its definitive Allen sound that has gotten over the years. So if you go back to an instrument from the 70s or the 80s, some of those sounds, even though they're better samples, obviously 40, 50 years later, are going to be incorporated. It's kind of an eclectic sound, a little bit of a mix. The next one that you're going to find is Aeolian Skinner, the great Boston firm, and they exemplified that eclectic American style of organ building in the first half of the 20th century. Arp Schnitger was a 17th century North German builder, very particular Baroque sound. And then Schlicker was a firm out of Buffalo, New York for many years, and they were one of the leaders in the neo-Baroque organ reform movement in the mid 20th century. It started in the mid 20th century, kind of extended to the end of the 20th century. And then Cavaille Cole, French Romantic builder. And finally, English Cathedral. That's primarily samples from instruments by Father Henry Willis, celebrated English builder, kind of English Romantic style, second half of the 19th century. So those are the 6 basic organ specifications. Occasionally you'll see organs that have an orchestral specification, where you have orchestral instruments that are secondary to the stops that are listed. And then there's also theater organ suites that originally you could add on, but with the new generation of instruments coming that you'll hear about soon, those also come default. So you actually will have 9 specifications and new organs coming out. I'm going to switch over to the console so you can see a little bit of the screen. It's so bright that it's not going to show up on here, but you can at least see a little bit of what I'm doing. So I'm going to talk about some ways you can use the suites, and we'll listen to some of the different sounds so we have available. To change suites on the organ, like I said, the default is the classic Allen. You would click on the main screen to Options, Stop List Library, and you just scroll through whatever you want. The first one we're going to open up is Arp Schnitger. You'd press load and that'll bring up your new instrument. The selection is going to be loaded between 7 to 10 seconds. Within 10 seconds, the new organ will be loaded. And when it loads, any registration that you have on here is going to clear. So if you have draw knobs pulled or tabs down, they're going to clear off. So you know that the new organ is loaded. Incidentally, the new Apex technology that Alan just introduced, that you'll be hearing about in an upcoming newsletter, has reduced that load time to nothing. It's pretty much instantaneous switching stop lists, so it makes it a lot easier to use them in the context of a service where you might need to move from one piece to another very quickly. When you change suites, you're loading a whole new set of sounds for each stop on the organ, so different organ suites or stop lists can't be recalled by pistons or memory levels. You have to set them when you want them. So how can we use these in the context of a service or in a recital? Often if I'm doing a dedication, I like to use nearly all the available suites and get people used to noticing the differences. Every organist has their own preference for a house suite. In my last church, we got a new Allen in 2010, replacing a 1960s analog instrument. I changed the default suite, which you can do in here, to Schlicker. That was the default load-up organ because that was the builder at my first church position over 20 years ago, so I had kind of a soft spot for it. And it was also a Lutheran church, so we did lots of Baroque repertoire. The Schlicker performed that very well. And I also found it very effective at leading hymn singing. It was easy to do singing in parts because everybody could pick out their part more easily with that specification. If you're doing a piece by Bach or another Baroque composer, you might want to look at the Schnicker stop list. This has broad but slightly chippy principal and flute choruses and a little bit thinner reeds than you'll find in some of the other stop lists. I call them gnarly. Gnarly has a negative connotation. I like the sound of these reeds. So this is the Arp Schnitger suite. Let's listen to the principal first. So definitely have that chip in there where you can good for counterpoint, but it has the little bit of width that makes it good for leading hymn singing too. It's going to be supportive of singing. Here's a harmonic flute 8 on the grate. Again, pretty deep flute sound. 4-foot spire flute. It's voiced a little bit softer than the 8-foot. And let's build up a principal chorus of 8, 4, and 2. So I think compared to some of the other stop lists that we're going to listen to, it has a little bit thinner sound to me. And the mixtures are pretty bright on here, as you'd expect for a Baroque. Something else that I'm going to want to compare besides those is the reeds. I think the reeds are the most noticeable difference between the stop lists. So here's a trompet 8 on the swell. The speech is a little bit slower in this style, especially when you get down to the lower end. And here's a Hautbois 8. Again, it has that slow speech down there. And this can work pretty well as a chorus reed, I think, if you combine it with the trumpet. It fills out a little bit in the frequencies. You could also use it as a solo stop if we draw that on the swell and then add the tremulant. It's a pretty bright oboe sound. And then we have a Crumhorn 8 in the positive. "16-foot bombard in the pedal. That's a pretty deep, tubby sound. We have the 4-foot reed as well. So if you bring everything together, it's going to sound like this. Now, for me personally, that's a little bit too thick of a sound. At least the way that it sounds in here, the way it's voiced. All of these suites, by the way, are individually voiceable. So if you were putting this in your church, you can go through each stop list and voice them individually. Each stop behaves differently in different rooms. So we're going to change over now, back into the stop list library. Scroll up to Cavaille Col and load that up. So for French Romantic piece, this is going to bring out both of the ethereal, we have gentle strings and celeste that we have in French Romantic music, as well as majesty. We have dominant fiery reeds compared to all the other stop lists, and really wide-scaled flutes that are nice for solo repertoire. So we're all loaded up now. Here's the principal on the Cavaille Col. Doesn't have nearly as much chiff. Principal chorus. So it's a little more balanced out, I find, with the 4-foot and the 2-foot. If we add on gradually. The 4-foot is pretty present. The 2-foot not quite as much, and the mixtures aren't going to be as bright. Has a little bit more of that 5th feel when you bring the mixture on than the other one for me. So let's listen to the celeste here. Here's the strings and the swell. It definitely has kind of a harmonium feel to it, a reed organ. Very gentle. Bring on the celeste. Let's add on the 8-foot flute. And here's that same 8-foot trumpet, but with the French specification. It speaks more like a fanfare trumpet, like a state trumpet, compared to the oboe. So much smoother sound. Bring on the tremulant. Really lovely. And then the 16-foot reed in the pedal here, very, very dominant and rough. And finally, the 8-foot reed in the positive. So you can start to hear some of the differences in these different styles. We're going to move over with one more, the English Cathedral. And this is one of my favorite stop lists. As you start to explore them, you notice the differences. This one's going to have a nice balance, more than the others I find, between the diapasons, the flutes, the reeds, and the mixtures than you would expect on an instrument from that part of the world. Nothing really jumps out, especially with the high and the low frequencies. English Cathedral ones, it's in a cathedral setting, so the frequencies are mixing in the room. It's not right there in your face. So here's the 8-foot principal. Nice foundation stop. Now if you add the 4-foot principal to this, You can definitely hear it, you perceive it, but it's not as noticeable. And then the 2-foot even less so. Just gives a little bit more of an edge, and the mixtures are very soft here. It's just very gently layering frequencies. Now this is very characteristic reeds. This is the crumb horn and the positive. Beautiful solo stop and bring on the tremolet. That thins out as it moves up the octave. And here's the trumpet on the swell. And the oboe. Now this is interesting because the oboe is very similar in tone to the trumpet. A little more nasal sound from the trumpet. But I think this 8-foot oboe would be much more effective as a chorus reed than as a solo, where on other ones I think it works better as a solo reed. So each stopless has its own characteristics. So that's something that you can explore on these kind of instruments. The next feature that we're going to look at is Acoustic Portrait. Reverberation has been a standard feature in digital instruments for decades, but only recently has convolution reverb become the benchmark for evaluating how well an organ replicates a piped organ in its natural environment. Instead of laying down a flat blanket reverb that affects all of the sound uniformly, convolution involves literally millions of calculations per second to accurately recreate a room's effect on every sound produced, and in the context of other voices mixed in. And that's managed by essentially sampling space, a lot like you would sample a pipe. Allen was the first organ builder to incorporate this technology into their instruments, and it's since been adopted by others because of its realism and the added depth that it gives. So this organ has 10 spaces you can choose from. Again, it's accessible from the display. And they are pipe chamber, small theater, small church, 3 different medium rooms, 2 large rooms, and 2 cathedrals. Each of these has their own characteristics that are much more easily perceived, I think, by the average parishioner than a change in suites might be. You might change suites on a piece and somebody won't notice. They'll notice if you change the reverb on it. And that can be adjusted within each space as well. So let's listen to a little bit and hear the difference. Let's start with pipe chamber. This is going to be right in front of the pipes, so you're not going to get virtually any reverb. Very present sound. And now let's move to a small church. And these take 2 or 3 seconds to load. Medium room 2. A very realistic sound. Large room 2. Cathedral. That's the most noticeable. You can really get the full effect of it. And they felt the need to put in a large cathedral as well, because a regular cathedral wasn't large enough. And that just goes on and on. And you can individually adjust it too. So the most extreme on here would be large cathedral and set the gain up to 6, which is as high as it goes. And I wouldn't use this for full organ because you would blow out the speakers. But for really soft effects, I've got a 4-foot flute on here. Not something you'd use for every day, probably more appropriate for a concert or for a voluntary, but definitely something you could explore. Now, as far as hymn singing goes, you want to find a setting that's going to work in your space. You want to spend some time with the different rooms and find out what's going to accompany singing the best. That's the main thing that we're doing in addition to the voluntaries. You can always ramp it up for concerts and voluntaries. You just don't want to forget to adjust it back after. That's the trick. And I would be lying if I said I never did that before. Okay. One of the things I like to do that I recommend is pairing specific rooms with particular suites. So we talked about the Schlicker. That has a thinner, crisp sound that I really like. Let's listen to that just a little bit so you can get a sense of how that works. Just a few seconds to load. So because this has that thinner sound, it's really good for polyphony. But if you have an overly reverberant room, either naturally or that you're using the convolution, it's going to wash it out and you're going to miss hearing some of those other parts. So this is set kind of middle. So you get a little bit of a boost, especially if you're in a dead room, and this is a lifesaver if you're in a dead room, which is what we had in my last church. Something like the Kavai Cole or the English Cathedral is designed to speak well in large rooms. So it depends on your space, and it's going to take some experimentation like all the other things that we've talked about. You want it to be mostly realistic to the size of the room, but you might be able to push a little bit beyond to produce that organ sound that we all love and that the congregation wants to hear. And it actually encourages singing if you have that little bit of reverb to push. The next thing we're going to look at is tuning. So here what we're really talking about with tuning is temperaments. This is a really underused feature of the organs that have it. I suspect because people think it won't be noticed by most parishioners, but it can make a huge difference in the sound, particularly with certain repertoire. There are 8 temperaments available: classic, romantic, baroque, Kernberger, Werkmeister, just, young, and Pythagorean. We don't have time to get into the details of all these, but that information is widely available, and I think it's worth exploring it, especially if you have an interest in early music or if you play a lot of early music in your church. That's one of the ways that I've used this. I typically only use the Baroque temperaments, obviously when I'm doing that repertoire, and I might use the just or the Pythagorean temperaments if I'm doing medieval or Renaissance repertoire. Sometimes I'll do Spanish Baroque pieces, and those have a lot thinner textures and long, sustained chords, and the difference is going to be a lot more noticeable. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play a little bit of something using the specification I'm on now. And on this organ, the alternate tuning, you can adjust which temperament you're using in the display. This is actually a draw knob below where you can see down here that you use to activate it. So you can set this to a piston, and then whatever your alternate tuning is set to, it will bring that on when you use your piston. So it's really easy to use in the context of a service. So let's start with classic tuning. We'll use an F sharp major chord because that's going to be a lot more noticeable with some of these. Now we'll move to Kernberger. Has that little bit of an edge. This, you wouldn't want to play something in F sharp major with this temperament, but here's Werkmeister. Just. You definitely don't want to play F sharp major with that one. And the young. And these I can actually change in real time, so I'm going to hold the chord down. You can hear the changes. So something like that, it actually does make a big difference. So let's say I'm going to do a piece of Spanish repertoire, I want something reedy, and I want to use the just intonation, which is kind of the crunchiest of them all. kind of brings that medieval sound to life in a way that you can't do if you're just playing on your regular specification and your regular temperament. The final feature we're going to look at today is also really easy to get to, and that is recording. That's something that's, I think, been more important over the course of the pandemic, and people are having a chance to explore these instruments a little bit more and what they can do. So for this one, you're going to go into autoplay to the recorder. This organ and similar models have 99 selections, slots of memory to which you can record. Because the files can't be renamed, as they can with some of the former systems where you could name a file whatever you want, like a regular computer, you do have to keep track somewhere which pieces are stored at which number if you're going to be using this feature. Where past instruments may have had a remote control, these organs now have their own built-in Wi-Fi network, which can be connected to a mobile phone and controlled by an app. Very, very easy to use, especially for somebody not familiar with the organ console layout. It can be a little daunting. Obviously, being able to record pieces is immensely helpful when you're taking a vacation and you can't get a substitute. Or if there's a part of the service like communion, I've done that before, where you can't be at the console, but music is needed. At my last church, I was up in a loft in the back, so if I wanted to take communion, I need to go all the way to the front. So I would often record something, and they'd be able to have work music during it. They wouldn't have to wait for me to get back up there. So I'm going to move to selection 3 on here. You simply hit record. And what you always want to do is hit the cancel button first to clear off anything that might be remaining, just in case you don't want anything carrying over. Bring on the stops that you want. Lay down recording. When you're done, hit cancel again, and then stop. You'll see there's a counter running on the screen, so you know when it's recording. And then everything's cleared off. We're going to hit play. You'll see the stops come on first when I drew them, just as I drew them. And then you'll see the cancel. So this is recording not just the notes that are happening, the sounds that are happening, it's also recording the capture action, the stop action. You can pull the stops manually or use pistons. One thing that the record function won't do is recall a particular suite, a memory level, or specific Genesis voices unless they're already loaded in. So I recommend saving your Genesis voice selections to a piston if you're using advanced mode like we talked about last time. Check that everything is right on the main screen, that you have all the voices that you want before playing back your recording to make sure that you're playing back the correct Genesis voices. You also want to look out for the levels on the expression shoes before and after you record. If a recording ends with the expression shoes all the way up or the crescendo all the way up, the recording ends and you go to play something, say you got back after communion and there's another piece that you need to play, it might still be all the way up. So you always want to check when you sit back down at the organ at the recording that it's set where you want it. And those are the 4 basic areas that we're looking at in today's session.